A new central park for El Paso that will transform the core of our city, or an unnecessary project that the city and its taxpayers can't afford to take on. Depending on who you ask, both of those could fit as a description of the proposed Deck Plaza, a park that would span 5 blocks over I-10 in downtown El Paso and cost something like $207 million to build. Over the last 2 decades, major cities in Texas and throughout the United States have built deck parks on top of freeways. The idea is to create new green space and prompt new development in areas of cities that decades ago were sliced up by the construction of big freeways. In El Paso, we've seen the Deck Plaza idea gain some steam recently, but there's still a lot of skepticism about the project and how much it will cost. Will building the deck park raise property taxes? Will this benefit all of El Paso or just wealthy urbanites? And is this the right time to take on this project? I'm your host, Diego Mendoza-Moyers, and this is another episode of the El Paso Matters podcast. Today, I'm joined by Pablo Villa, assistant editor of El Paso Matters, to talk through these questions and more about the Deck Plaza. Pablo, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Diego. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the El Paso Matters podcast. I'm Pablo, and I'm stepping into the host seat today with the very generous permission of our usual host, Diego Mendoza-Moyers. Thanks for letting me take the wheel, Diego. As Diego alluded to, the reason we're switching things up is because Diego's been working on a story that's both complex and incredibly important to the future of downtown El Paso, and that's the proposed Deck Plaza over Interstate 10. It's a project that's been years in the making, but in recent weeks, things have really started to move. There's momentum, there's money on the table, and there's still a lot of questions to work through. So today we're turning the mic around and putting Diego in the proverbial hot seat, in the most collegial way, of course, to break down where things stand, what's at stake, and what El Pasoans should be paying attention to in the months ahead. So Diego, let's start with the basics. What exactly is the Deck Plaza project, and where in downtown El Paso is it supposed to be located?
Yeah, so it's this idea that we've, as you kind of said, it's been in the works for almost a decade as a concept. And so it would span 5 blocks over Interstate 10 in downtown. So the trenched portion of the freeway that cuts through kind of the northern edge of downtown El Paso, it begins with Santa Fe Street and it would go east to Campbell Street, I believe. And so, the idea is we've sort of got this trench with these fast-moving vehicles that cut right through downtown. Was built decades ago, and so the thinking is, hey, let's go ahead and instead of just having this trench in downtown, let's put this park with a lot of amenities, right, and gardens and trails and other kind of conceptual ideas of amenities, and let's kind of create this new real estate. And the ultimate thinking is that this will make this area much more attractive. Instead of having a freeway, we've got a park, and so then that'll bring in new housing and multi-floor apartments and retail and so forth. And so I think the thinking is really. It's kind of this park would be the catalyst to prompt more development downtown, ideally, right, and raise property values and property tax revenue for the city. That's kind of the ideal thinking and reasoning for this project.
Sounds immense, Diego. Now, supporters often point to Klyde Warren Park in Dallas as a model. Can you walk us through how the El Paso project compares and what's unique about this proposal?
Yeah, so the Klyde Warren Park is kind of a lot of people point to it as kind of the ideal kind of deck park project because it took this really wide Woodall-Rogers freeway in downtown Dallas and it put a cap on it, and all of a sudden you've got, it prompted a lot of development of apartments, and I think there was only a few hundred people living in downtown Dallas prior to Klyde Warren opening in 2012, and now I believe there are thousands of housing units. So that's kind of what the people in El Paso that want this deck park look to as the model. One thing that's interesting about it, obviously, Dallas has a lot of money, right, and a lot of people associated with the finance and energy industry. So, there were some champions of the project there and wealthy individuals who put up a lot of money initially to really kind of turn it from this, kind of vague concept into a real thing. And of course, it opened in 2012, so the price was $112 million, I believe, to build the whole thing. Obviously, less than this would cost us just because of inflation. But a key fact about Klyde Warren is that 50% of it was paid for by private philanthropists. And so, we can get into the funding puzzle for the El Paso's Deck Plaza a little bit, but I think that's a key thing to remember, that private dollars funded half of that project. And I think that's what city officials in El Paso would like the ratio to be for the deck park. Maybe 50% some form of public funds and 50% from, the pockets of wealthy philanthropists. So that's, Klyde Warren's a really successful example of a deck plaza, and I think something that we should strive for, but the funding piece is key to remember that half of that came from private dollars.
You mentioned in your response that vague ideas turn into actual, big things, right, for Dallas. It's sort of the case here in El Paso, right? We've seen a big shift from vague ideas to more concrete funding proposals in recent weeks. What are the key pieces of the financial puzzle, and how solid are they at this point?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the big question that anybody will bring up when you talk about the deck park is like, so how much is it going to cost? And will it raise my taxes? And so the Downtown Deck Plaza Foundation, which is kind of a foundation, the Paso del Norte Foundation spun off to sort of advocate for this project, they commissioned a cost study that they shared with the public last summer, and so that's where they came up with the $207 million cost estimate for the price of the deck itself, which is I believe 6.5 acres, and the amenities on top. So they have that cost estimate, and so then the following question is, okay, where do those funds come from? And so we kind of saw the first real firm dollars put forward, I guess, or maybe I shouldn't say firm dollars, but we saw in the Texas Senate budget that Senator Cesar Blanco successfully included in their $10 million for the deck plaza to sort of pay for like construction blueprints. That's not final. That would have to end up in the final state budget that will probably be passed in June once the Texas Senate and Texas House kind of reconcile their different budgets. But that was significant, right, to see that our state senator had successfully gotten his colleagues to include a $10 million allocation for the deck park to, like I said, pay for the actual kind of blueprints and design documents. So that was pretty significant. And then a couple of weeks later, we heard from the Deck Plaza Foundation folks that they plan to bring in $25 million from philanthropy, and so that's a pretty sizable chunk of the project cost paid for by private dollars, and that was the first real commitment that we've heard from philanthropy. I mean, we've kind of heard all along, that philanthropy would play a role, but we hadn't really seen any dollar figures associated with that. So $25 million would come for philanthropy. On top of the $10 million from the legislature, and then we know that the backers are applying for this transportation alternative set-aside grant. It's kind of a grant funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law that Congress passed a few years ago, and the idea is to sort of fund like non-vehicle related transportation projects. So the Deck Plaza backers talk about that as if they're fairly confident they're going to get it, which would be another $25 million. So $25 million from the private donors, maybe $25 million from the state, the other separate $10 million from the state, and then the city this week kind of suggested that it would be willing to contribute $35 million. And so some of the people with the city's economic development department said the city can contribute this $35 million. That would be a fair, proportionate contribution, and also feasible in the sense that the city could come up with that money without really raising taxes or deteriorating its finances. So that's kind of what we have so far is it's about $85 million in funding commitments thereabouts for the construction part of it, which is still almost $100 million short, right? The construction cost they think will be something like $188 million, and then about $20 million for design. Design mostly paid for. The construction, like I said, about $100 million short. And so where does that money come from is still the remaining question. There's a possibility El Paso County contributes some funds. We don't know how much. We know that they're kind of open to it, and County Judge Samaniego has been very vocally supportive of the deck park. So, we could see some money come from El Paso County. There's maybe some opportunities for federal dollars. We know, the funding landscape at the federal level under the Trump administration is different than it was under the Biden administration, which was, awarding grants and kind of giving out money a little bit more freely, I guess. And so, whether those federal dollars come is kind of a really big question. But something, in my previous answer, I said that the Klyde Warren Park was funded by 50% private donors, right? So if you think, $25 million out of $207 million is much less than 50%. And so, I think, maybe you could say, well, the private philanthropy amount has to increase to kind of make this project feasible. City Manager Dion Mack did make it clear this week that, if the funding isn't there, like the project's not going to happen. The city's not going to overextend itself to make it happen. But if we can kind of, stitch these various funding sources together, whether the county chips in, maybe some dollars from the feds and from the state, maybe there's kind of a viable path ahead.
Diego, you've got an excellent handle on the money picture for this project. It's $207 million that's being funded that's potentially being funded through all these sources, and you have a really good handle on how that's working so far, even though it's a very muddled picture right now. One thing that isn't so murky is the date that this is all supposed to happen, right? One of the big sticking points seems to be timing. Why is the 2027 construction date such a critical deadline? And how is the Texas Department of Transportation's timeline shaping the urgency around this project?
Yeah, so a key part of this is the fact that really like the whole thing that spurred the idea for the deck plaza was, TxDOT, they're widening the freeway. They're widening I-10. They're spending $1 billion to do it in El Paso because they say, if the highway doesn't have an extra lane, decades from now as El Paso grows, the traffic's going to get a lot worse. So you've seen that work ongoing in Northwest El Paso, kind of in the West Town Marketplace, Cimarron area, really snarled traffic out there. And it's been a big multi-year project. And so that, the next step of that is going to be downtown, which, as you can imagine, probably will be a little bit of a disaster traffic wise, right? And really, create a challenge for traveling through there. So the thinking is, well, if TxDOT is going to go ahead and do this widening project, which by the way, a lot of locals here don't approve of, but TxDOT's moving forward with it. Why don't we take advantage of the fact they're going to be doing this work on I-10 and say, okay, they're already going to be ripping up the road and totally rebuilding it. So why don't we at the same time build this deck on top? And I think supporters of the deck park view this as like kind of a once in a generation window, right? In the sense that it probably won't be too feasible to build this if TxDOT wasn't doing its project on I-10. And so that's why the deck park supporters want this to really match up with TxDOT's timeline on expanding the freeway downtown. And so TxDOT, the project has gotten a little bit delayed. I think the anticipation is that they're going to begin soliciting bids next year and probably start awarding bids for construction in 2027. And so that's basically when, if this project's going to happen, the city has to put up those construction funds. I mentioned it's $188 million roughly. We'll see that cost estimate crystallize a little bit more in the months and years ahead, but the city has to put up the funds for construction by 2027. And kind of more urgently, the city has to fund that $20 million design of all the construction documents and blueprints and so forth. They have to fund that like in a few months because TxDOT needs to know, that because if TxDOT's going to incorporate this deck into their, design and construction work on I-10, they need to have these design sort of documents there at the ready. So that's this funding for the design has to come together in the months ahead, like by the end of this year. But the city has a little bit more time. The city and the Deck Plaza supporters have a little bit more time until, sometime in 2027 to put up the construction funds. But it's still a short timeline, to usually projects like this. I mean, it's been in the works for several years, but this funding picture is coming together quickly. And it's kind of a short timeline for a project this big. So that's a big question that we've, opponents have said, there's this big funding gap. Can we fill that in a relatively short time span? But that's why it's really picking up steam and becoming more of an urgent issue.
A tight window for sure, right, to make all this happen. You mentioned opponents there in your last thought. So we do have a lot of enthusiasm for this project, but there's also still a fair amount of skepticism about it, both from prominent community members and even some city council members as well. What are the main concerns being raised, and how are supporters of the deck addressing them?
Yeah, I mean, and number one is the cost, right? And I think that there's a perception that the cost estimate will prove to not be totally accurate, right? And, which would be the first time in El Paso that we've seen something, go over budget and maybe take a little bit longer than expected. And that's not to say that that's the reality for this project, but I think that's kind of the perception that we could see it advance, and then all of a sudden that $207 million cost estimate, balloons up, and can we really afford that? The other thing too is, I mean, just the property tax burden that people in El Paso, they're really opposed to seeing those taxes increase, right? And so, the question of whether, can we fund this with outside dollars and without issuing a bond to pay for it with taxpayer dollars, kind of, I think that's one of the big concerns from people who are skeptical about this project. And then I think there's also kind of this sense of do we need it? Who is this for? It's great for people that live in Sunset Heights, right? But are people on the, on the east side or in more outlying areas of the city going to use this and enjoy this? Which I think if you look at San Jacinto Plaza downtown, I mean, that's usually pretty well populated, particularly on the weekends and around holidays and stuff. So I think you could envision people from all over, utilizing this deck park if it becomes a reality. But I still think it's a fair question to say, do we need another downtown quality of life project over maybe redirecting these funds elsewhere? One question or one point is that if the legislature puts up, tens of millions, the private donors put up tens of millions, that kind of raises the pressure on the city and county to maybe chip in too with some taxpayer dollars. So that's kind of another thing that I think people who are skeptical of deck park don't want the county and city to sort of get roped into this project. Say the cost balloons, right? And it, but still there's this pressure to keep going. I think that's one concern, that the city kind of overextends itself to make this project a reality, because it looks cool on paper, right? But maybe ultimately proves not to be sort of viable financially. So those are the big concerns. And then I guess also there's a perception that the deck park will create a lot of traffic and challenges like that. But the reality is, TxDOT's going to move forward with this big reconstruction regardless of the deck park. And so I think we're going to have traffic snarls, no matter what happens with the deck park.
Diego, you got a handle on all of it up to now, right? I want to ask you a hypothetical though. Let's say everything works out. Let's say this deck plaza does come together, right? Construction funding, TxDOT coordination, all of that. There's still the question of what would come after. What do we know so far about who would operate and maintain the deck plaza park, and how would that be funded year to year?
Yeah, so this is obviously a key question, because you can put up all the money in the world to build it, but then, there's going to be ongoing costs, right? Whether it's maintenance and security and paying to host events in the park, right? Programming and what have you, and, bringing in food trucks or whatever. There are many costs associated with a big, a 5-block long park. And so the thinking is that the maintenance and operations actually could cost as much as $7 million a year, which kind of surprised me. That was, a pretty hefty sum. The Deck Plaza Foundation has proposed that, private donors could pay $5.5 million of that cost annually. So they could bear the majority of the maintenance and operations, private donors. There's kind of a proposal that the city and county would chip in $750,000 each annually to fund maintenance and operations, or, help pay for it. That money, the idea for now, and this is a little bit wonky, but the idea for now is to expand what's called the tax increment reinvestment zone, which is basically, it's kind of a zone in downtown where the property values are held flat for property tax purposes. And then as investors come in and improve, buildings and infrastructure and everything, the property taxes increase. But those, that increased property tax revenue is reinvested in the zone to improve infrastructure. So the thinking is that, as the property tax revenue from that zone increases, you could redirect some of the funds to pay for some of that ongoing maintenance operations. And the thinking there is that the people who are benefiting, the property owners in the area, are, kind of reinvesting some of the money back into the area to pay for the expense associated with the park. So that's kind of the thinking on maintenance and operations, is that really private donors bear most of the costs, and there's a little bit of public dollars that are spent on it. But yeah, we can't forget about the ongoing costs that would be really high for continuing to operate the park for years to come.
All right, Diego, thank you. That's all the questions I have for you, and that's going to do it for this special edition of the El Paso Matters podcast. Big thank you to Diego Mendoza-Moyers, not just for letting me take over the host chair today, but for all his thorough and ongoing reporting on the Deck Plaza and everything surrounding it. This is a project that could reshape the heart of our city, and as we've heard, there's still a lot to figure out. So thank you, Diego.
Thanks for switching seats with me, Pablo. And you can read all of our reporting on the Deck Plaza and downtown redevelopment at elpasomatters.org. And make sure to tune in to our next episode of the El Paso Matters podcast.